Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to John chapter 12, beginning at the 20th verse. Now among those who went up to worship at the festival were some Greeks. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and said to him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Jesus answered them, The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains just a single grain. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Those who love their life lose it, and those who hate their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honour. Now my soul is troubled. And what should I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified, and I will glorify it again. The crowd standing heard it and said that it was thunder. Others said, an angel has spoken to him. Jesus answered, this voice has come for your sake, not for mine. Now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw people to myself. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Well, it's delightful for Joy and for me to be with you here again in your beautiful church. And I was just thinking as we drove here, what a little haven of sanctuary Travancore is, between freeways and tram depots, and what a delightful place. And for the discerning, what an addition a church in the local community is. Today we recall the Martyrs of Papua New Guinea. And I think they were for certainly a generation of Anglicans who were contemporaneous with them, and then through the 50s and into the 60s, models of something that was a very powerful story, a powerful link between Australia and the people of Papua, and something about the enactment of those things which, as you read them in history or back in antiquity, they seem distant stories of martyrdom. And this was not without controversy, because the bishop at the time, Philip Strong, was certainly encouraged by people, certainly by some of the parents of the missionaries, because they were young people, young nurses, young priests. He was encouraged by the government resident that he should make urgent steps to evacuate all the Australian missionaries from Papua, because there was this risk of the Japanese invasion. But he argued, and he had a simple argument, which I suspect we wouldn't mount. But he had a simple argument that if the missionaries had gone there in good times to carry the gospel of Jesus to the people of Papua, so they must, in bad times and in difficult times, continue that witness of God's presence and God's revelation in Christ to the people of Papua. That was his reasoning. But it was not without controversy, and I'm sure it brought him much anguish, and certainly got him some hostile responses. You know, after these wonderful people, young people were killed, some of the families were looking at what had happened. How were they committed to remain in a place of danger? And as I say, I think today, in our thinking, we would be perhaps congratulating people to being evacuated. You know, there would be a great happiness that they had been taken out of that place of danger. But as it was, and they had free choice, but as it was, with his encouragement and their sense of resonating with that simple proposition, they stayed in their positions, and different positions at different mission stations, pretty much on the north coast of Papua. So if you know, there's a kind of long part of Papua New Guinea that runs out towards the east, and Port Moresby is on the southern side, and across there's the Kokoda Tract, which goes across the big mountains, and you end up in what they call the Oro province, where the people are the Orokaibans. And I'm wearing some vestments today that they kindly gave me on a visit. I'm even wearing this. And for those who are vegans, I am sorry, some pigs were harmed in the production of this otahu. They are pig tusks off a particularly big pig. But this is a kind of a, things that the chiefs wear ritually, and they kindly made one of these and had I think it's a tortoiseshell cross. It may not be, maybe a piece of plastic looks like tortoiseshell, I think. That was part of their cultural enactment of the gospel. And it's, when you go to a place like that, this kind of witness of the martyrs, amongst whom were Papuans, and one of them, Lucian Tapiati, is in a statue of the 20th century martyrs above the door of Westminster Abbey as you enter. It's a range of the martyrs of the 20th century there, including Janani Lawon, the Archbishop of Uganda, Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others, but also Lucian Tapiati, one of the Guinea martyrs. So for people in Papua, and certainly for people in Australia, they identified very strongly with these people in their deaths, which were usually pretty much happened. Some were execution-style killings from Japanese forces, others a bit more mysterious. Lucian Tapiati was killed with an axe by his countrymen, but there were various circumstances in different sites. But people identified strongly with them because they were people who, it seemed to the people at the time, were facing a godless regime. Japanese imperial forces were understood to be quite godless and merciless and intent on invading Australia. So here were people, as it were, beyond the front line of the Australian nation who had paid this sacrifice, not as combatants, but as people only there to act with mercy, to be nurses, teachers and priests amongst the people of Papua. So it was quite transformational for a generation of Australians, and quite transformational for the people of Papua, who maintain now, after nearly 50 years of independence, a lively and indigenised faith. And I have some small link in that. One of the martyrs was a man who was my predecessor at Mitchell River, Kawanyama, many years before me, as the priest there, a man called Henry Matthews. He was there before me, and he later went to Darwin as a priest, right? They later went, but he died because he was evacuating some children from Port Moresby, and in the Papuan Gulf, his mission ship, which he was evacuating these children with, was sunk by a torpedo, and he and others perished. Some survived, but there were all sorts of ordinary people just doing ordinary things that seemed to be merciful responses to a situation whose lives came to an end. And so we have one church in this diocese in Croydon Hills, which is the Church of the Guinea Martyrs. And in places I know in Queensland where some of the martyrs came from, they're being remembered in a lively way. And it's a bit like the honour board from the First World War you see up the front of your church, which you see in the front of many churches. As those personal relationships are no longer there because we didn't know those people. We might not even be family members. We don't know their families. We're not living in a contemporary time. We don't have the same thinking of what their thinking was. Their world looks a very strange and different world. It sometimes is more difficult for us to understand what it is that is memorable and also exemplary that we might take into our generation. And I think that's always the challenge for the Christian gospel in every generation of people. Because the Christian gospel has only come to us, I think, because of two things. They're not complicated. One is, it gets renewed into a new generation. And it doesn't matter how old we were once young people, and someone bothered to speak to us about the good news of Jesus that influenced us to become believers in the Lord Jesus Christ and members of his church. And that's a wonderful thing we can do it. Sometimes, I go to places and people say, well, come on, you're dreaming. How's this going to happen? We're not in the capacity to initiate things with children. But interestingly, I was at a parish last week out at Cheltenham, and they had that same problem. And so they went to one of our Anglican schools, went to Third Anglican school, and they said, this is our dilemma. What do you think we could do? You've got a lot of children here. How would you? And the chaplain said, well, look, we've got a really great faith captain who's graduating from Year 12 this year. Why don't you talk to her? And so now, when I was there last week, the Year 12 faith captain from last year and one of her friends, they're there running a Sunday school for 4 or 5 little kids. One man we met who travels all the way from North Baldwin to Cheltenham because he wants to be at that place with his little children. And so, it's interesting that if we have, in a sense, a perception of what it is to be the church in a place, in a generation, some of these questions, they mightn't be immediately obvious to us how we answer them, but there may well be things that we could observe from the practice of others. And that's the great thing that I know that Father Richard is introducing into the discussion of the parish council and the parish, some of these concepts he put about reimagining the future, what kind of how will be a church in our context in the future, and then leading your church into growth, some of the practices we can learn from that. And the second of those things that we need to do in each generation is carry the good news of the gospel across cultures, because that's how it's come down to us as well. Some of you may be, but I'm certainly not, a person of the Mediterranean. That was the civilized world 2,000 years ago. They were the people of anyone in the Mediterranean and into what they used to call, from the position of Western Europe, the Near East, through to what's now Syria and Iraq and Iran and North India. These, through to China later on as they came to have contact, these were thought to be the people of the civilized world. And they were the people who were thought to be proper to understand these things about the gospel when it was decided that Christianity would break out of being just a Jewish sect into a non-Jewish people, which is a big jump, but then to go to be civilized people. But alas, to my ancestors, it took many, many centuries for people to have the courage to make contact with them in Northern Europe, because they were thought to be uncivilized, thought to be barbarians, because according to the civilized people like the Greeks, the Latins, all they could do was babble. So, the language sounded like bop, 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 bop. Didn't make sense to anyone. Thought they didn't even have language. How then were they human? And this was the question people sat on for centuries until someone was courageous enough to go across those boundaries of culture to carry the good news of Jesus, because they had a vision. No, this is something which, and so you can see some of these things that we look in the modern world, especially at the failures of the modern world, the failures of how the world unfolded and cultures interacted. People probably still had those questions. My doctoral work was in Western Cape York, where both Henry Matthews and I lived and worked, and I think it was the case there that certainly Aboriginal people looked at whites when they encountered them and wondered if they were human. Because for several hundred years, they'd only encountered male white men. They'd never seen any white females. So they would have wondered, these are strange kind of creatures, and they postulated that they were somehow the spirits of the dead returned, because they had all these, as it were, supernatural powers. They could kill you at a distance. Wow, they couldn't do that. They could throw a spear, but these people had something and hear a noise, and you could be dead at a distance. That must be like a spirit. So from both sides of cultural encounter, people have this question. Well, do we actually share the one humanity? And it's to the great wonder of the long journey of Christian faith that often, against the language and the attitudes of the culture, people have that vision to see across those differences the common need, the good news of the gospel, as being a gift that needs to go to all people everywhere. And so that's why I say, I think in every generation, taking things across into a new generation and across the boundaries of culture, as we are able in our context, is one of the great gifts of the Christian church. And that was something that those missionaries of Papua New Guinea were intent to try and do in their own way. And their example came to be a great example for the recruitment of many missionaries after the Second World War to go and be present in that Anglican work, which the Anglicans they're only a minority kind of Christian group in Papua New Guinea. In some areas they're very dominant in Oro and Milne Bay, but most of Papua New Guinea, they're very small represented. Most people are Catholic or Lutheran, Pentecostal sects or SDAs or whatever they are, depending on the areas of influence. But it gave people a sense of, these people sacrificed all of their life. Could we give something of what is the gift to us in that work? And that continues. One of my colleagues, Jeffrey Driver, the former Bishop of Gippsland and the former Archbishop of Adelaide, now in his retirement, he's been working with the Theological College in Popondetta to help it gain accreditation, because the Papua New Guinea government had just brought in tertiary accreditation into that country. And so to run a theological college, you need to get accreditation. He's worked on that. And now there is interest, and I think some initiative from the local Popondetta, local state government, to help bring together a nursing college that has existed in another place and a teachers' college on the one side. So that could be a generous contribution. Because when I've been to some of these places in Papua New Guinea, people look back, often the Papuan people look back with great longing to the times when they had much more contact with Australians and Australian missionaries. Because after independence in 1975, Joy and I were visited there the next year in 1976 to Daru in the Western Province, and the independence of Papua New Guinea was a courageous move, and the decolonising was very drastic. But we know in the nearly 50 years that have unfolded, there are many forces at work, some of which are part of the traditional culture and some are not all to the good. The targeting of people as witches or sorcerers, people being burnt and murdered, particularly in the highlands, is a very cruel thing that's continuing. And I know that the Papua New Guinean government is eager to try and gain some resource, probably like the Australian military or the Australian Federal Police, to go and help them contain some of these practices, particularly in the highlands. So I rejoice that we have ongoing partnerships with Papua New Guinea. I think it is one of the big strategic questions. Mid-century, the population of Papua New Guinea equals about half of the Australian population. And I can tell you, the people that will not sit going hungry in the highlands, they will come to Australia in large numbers, unless there is development in that country. So I think that what we can do as a church, we have trusted relationships, and often some of the more ethical relationships, because sadly a lot of politics in Melanesia, and particularly in Papua New Guinea, is run along big man tribal lines, and it doesn't always mean that the little people get much benefit from the big money that the big people in Port Moresby play with. But often churches, especially entities like the Mothers Union, powerless people, but often very ethically conducted, and have been in some of our development partnerships very significant. So I feel optimistic that the witness of the Martyrs of Papua New Guinea is something that's lasting. It's something which is not just an encouragement to the Anglican Church or Christians, but it shows something of the solidarity that I think is needed with our nearest neighbours, because we share a border. We actually share a contiguous border, and Australia goes to within a few kilometres of the South Papuan coast, of Torres Strait, is Australian, and there is much contact still across that border. So bless us as we remember that witness of the Papua New Guinea Martyrs, and bless you here at St George's as you discern how you might be a living and vital presence of the good news of the gospel in your local community, and that your devotion might be something that carries an encouragement to the people of your local community.